This Russian Revolution documentary takes you through the tumultuous years between 1905 and 1923. From the first sparks of uprising in 1905 through the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the dual power struggles of 1917, the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, to the brutal civil war and the creation of the USSR, we explore the forces, people, and events that transformed Russia forever. This is a story of power, revolution, and survival, where hope, fear, and ambition collided to reshape an entire nation. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire appeared as an immovable giant upon the world map. It stretched across two continents, from the icy ports of the Baltic to the wide plains of Siberia and the Pacific Ocean. Its borders enclosed over 1/6 of the planet's land surface, a territory so vast that it contained a dozen climates and hundreds of ethnic groups. More than 125 million people lived under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the last monarch of a dynasty that had governed Russia for more than 3 centuries. To the outside world, it was an empire of cathedrals, palaces, and armies. But beneath the surface, it was an empire standing on unsteady ground, a realm that carried both the weight of ancient traditions and the tremors of a new industrial age. Tsar Nicholas II believed that his power came directly from God. His coronation in 1896, held in Moscow's Uspensky Cathedral, had symbolized that divine connection between the autocrat and the Orthodox faith. Yet even then, the empire he inherited was beginning to fracture. The world beyond Russia's borders was changing rapidly. Across Europe, industrial progress was reshaping society. Electricity illuminated the streets of Paris and London. Railways and factories symbolized the power of modernity. But in Russia, modern life existed only in small pockets, mostly around St. Petersburg, Moscow, and a few other growing cities. The vast majority of Russians still lived in rural villages, bound to the soil and to traditions centuries old. In those villages, life had changed little since the days of serfdom, which had been abolished only in 1861. Most peasants worked small strips of land, producing barely enough to survive. Heavy taxes, poor harvests, and a lack of modern tools kept them in poverty. The old social order remained intact. Nobles and landowners owned enormous estates while millions of peasants tilled the land under their control. The Russian peasantry, which made up nearly 80% of the population, carried the weight of the empire on their backs but had little to show for it. Hunger was common, disease widespread, and literacy rare. It was a society out of balance. Modern industry and technology were growing, but social and political structures had remained frozen in an earlier century. In the cities, a different world was forming. Factories filled the air with smoke as Russia began its late but rapid industrial expansion. Coal mines opened in the Donbass, ironworks rose in the Urals, and textile mills spread across Moscow and St. Petersburg. Millions of peasants left their villages to seek work in these factories, drawn by the hope of wages, but soon trapped by long hours and harsh conditions. 12-hour shifts, unsafe machinery, and low pay became the norm. Entire families crowded into dark, damp tenements. In this environment of exploitation, new ideas began to circulate. Workers read illegal pamphlets smuggled from Europe, texts that spoke of equality, collective ownership, and workers' rights. Socialism, born in the industrial centers of the West, began to take root in the heart of Imperial Russia. Among educated Russians, discontent was also growing. The country's universities had become centers of radical thought. Students and intellectuals debated political reform, constitutional government, and revolution. Many were inspired by the writings of Karl Marx, who predicted that industrial workers would one day rise against their rulers. Others looked to the examples of Western Europe, where parliaments limited the power of monarchs. In Russia, however, the Tsar's authority remained absolute. There was no elected government, no freedom of speech or press, and political opposition was treated as treason. Secret police watched universities and factories closely, arresting those who dared to question the autocracy. Yet despite repression, revolutionary movements multiplied. Groups such as the Socialist Revolutionaries, who sought to represent the peasants, and the Social Democrats, who focused on the urban working class, began organizing underground networks. Within these circles, the future leaders of revolution, including Vladimir Lenin, were already forming their ideas. As the new century began, Russia faced growing challenges both at home and abroad. The empire's economy was expanding, but its infrastructure was fragile. Rapid industrialization had brought new wealth to a small elite, but had deepened inequality among workers and peasants. Political opposition was rising, but the government responded with censorship and violence. The Tsar's ministers often disagreed on reform, fearing that any concession would weaken autocracy. Nicholas II himself was indecisive, relying heavily on his family and a small circle of advisors. He saw any attempt at modernization as a threat to his divine authority. This stubbornness would become one of his greatest weaknesses. In 1903, the Social Democratic Party split into two factions. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, believed that a small, disciplined revolutionary party should lead the working class to seize power. The Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov, favored a broader, more democratic movement. Though small and fragmented at first, these groups represented a new kind of political energy in Russia, one that no longer sought reform from the Tsar, but aimed for his overthrow. By 1904, Nicholas II faced a crisis that would expose the empire's fragility to the world. In the Far East, Russia had expanded its influence into Korea and Manchuria, colliding with another rising power, Japan. The Russo-Japanese War began that year, and the Tsar, confident in his divine mission, expected an easy victory. Many in Europe shared that expectation. Russia was a great empire, while Japan was seen as a minor Asian state. But those assumptions quickly dissolved. The Japanese army and navy, modern and well-prepared, inflicted devastating defeats on the Russians. The fall of Port Arthur in early 1905 and the destruction of the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima shocked the nation. For the first time, an Asian power had defeated a European empire. The humiliation reverberated through Russian society. Soldiers died in the thousands, supplies ran short, and corruption within the military command became clear. The cost of war strained the economy, causing food shortages and inflation. In the winter of 1904 to 1905, as news of defeat spread, discontent turned to anger. Workers in St. Petersburg went on strike over low wages and high prices. The strikes spread quickly, uniting factory workers, students, and peasants in a rare moment of solidarity. Many still believe the Tsar was unaware of their suffering. They saw him as a benevolent father misled by corrupt officials. To reach him, they decided to march peacefully to his palace with a petition for change. As the new year began, Russia stood at a crossroads. Its empire remained vast, but its power was hollow. The railways, symbols of progress, could not carry enough food to the starving cities. Its army, once the pride of the Tsar, was demoralized and poorly equipped. Its people, long patient under hardship, were beginning to lose faith. The air was thick with tension, though few yet understood what was about to unfold. Beneath the frost and silence of winter, the ground was shifting. The world that had seemed eternal was nearing its end. Within months, the illusion of imperial stability would collapse, and the streets of St. Petersburg would run red with blood. The revolution that would reshape the 20th century was already moving, silent and unseen, through the factories, the barracks, and the fields of the Russian Empire. The year 1905 would not simply bring protest. It would mark the beginning of the storm that would sweep away a dynasty and change the course of history. By the first days of 1905, the silence of the Russian winter carried a growing sense of despair. The failures of the Russo-Japanese War had exposed the weakness of the empire. Soldiers returning from the Far East brought home stories of defeat, corruption, and needless sacrifice. The cost of war had drained the treasury, and prices in the cities rose sharply. Bread became scarce, and wages did not keep pace with inflation. In factories across St. Petersburg, Moscow, and other industrial centers, discontent deepened. The people no longer saw the empire as a source of strength, but as a burden crushing them from above. The social order that had once seemed unshakable was beginning to tremble. Among those who tried to channel this discontent was a priest named Georgy Gapon. He was young, energetic, and sympathetic to the workers' suffering. Gapon organized what became known as the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers, an officially sanctioned group that encouraged loyalty to the Tsar while addressing the concerns of laborers. He believed that if the workers could appeal directly to the Tsar, Nicholas II would listen. To him, the emperor was not an oppressor but a misunderstood father who needed to hear the cries of his people. Gapon's plan was simple: to lead a peaceful procession to the Winter Palace, carrying a petition that demanded fair wages, shorter working hours, and an end to corruption. Many of those who joined him believed this would be a turning point, a day of reconciliation between ruler and people. On the morning of January 22, 1905, tens of thousands of men, women, and children gathered on the streets of St. Petersburg. They carried icons of Christ, portraits of the Tsar, and banners that read, "Do not shoot at the people." It was bitterly cold. The snow covered the frozen city as the columns of workers moved toward the Winter Palace in silence and prayer. They came not as an army, but as citizens hoping for justice. Many still believed that the Tsar would step out onto the balcony, bless them, and promise to right the wrongs that had plagued their lives. But Nicholas II was not in the palace that day. His ministers, nervous about the size of the demonstration, ordered troops to guard the city. As the crowds approached the square before the Winter Palace, they met lines of soldiers armed with rifles. The marchers continued forward, singing hymns and calling for mercy. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. Soldiers fired directly into the crowd. Panic spread. Men and women fell onto the snow, which quickly turned red. Parents shielded their children, but bullets tore through the masses. Screams echoed across the square as the soldiers advanced, firing volley after volley. By the time the shooting stopped, hundreds lay dead, and many more were wounded. The streets of St. Petersburg were covered in bodies. The petition never reached the Tsar. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. The image of peaceful citizens being slaughtered outside the palace destroyed the myth of the benevolent Tsar. The man who had been called Little Father was now seen as an enemy of his own people. The news spread rapidly through the empire. Newspapers published accounts of the massacre, and word traveled by rail and telegraph to distant provinces. In villages and cities alike, outrage erupted. Workers went on strike, peasants rose against landowners, and soldiers began to question their loyalty. What had started as a peaceful appeal had become the spark for a nationwide revolution. By February, strikes had paralyzed factories in St. Petersburg, Riga, and Baku. The railway network, the lifeline of the empire, ground to a halt. Sailors in the port city of Kronstadt mutinied, refusing orders from their officers. The empire's vast bureaucracy began to falter as civil servants hesitated to enforce the Tsar's decrees. In the countryside, peasants attacked estates, looting food and burning manor houses. The spirit of defiance spread like fire through dry grass. For the first time in centuries, the Tsar's authority was openly challenged by his subjects on every front. The government responded with repression. The Okhrana, Russia's secret police, arrested thousands of activists and filled prisons with political prisoners. Demonstrations were broken up by force. Yet violence only deepened the anger. Revolutionary groups that had been operating underground now saw an opportunity. The socialist revolutionaries called for the redistribution of land and the overthrow of autocracy. The Social Democrats, both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, called for workers' councils to seize control of factories and cities. In many places, spontaneous Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, were formed to organize strikes and distribute food. These Soviets became symbols of a new kind of power rising from below. In June, rebellion spread to the Black Sea Fleet. Sailors aboard the battleship Potemkin mutinied after being served rotten meat infested with maggots. When their officers tried to punish them, the sailors turned their weapons against their superiors. They seized control of the ship, executed several officers, and raised the red flag of revolution. The Potemkin sailed to the port of Odessa, where strikes and protests had already erupted. When government troops opened fire on the crowds gathered at the docks, hundreds more were killed. The mutiny shocked the world, demonstrating that the empire's own armed forces were no longer reliable. Though the Potemkin mutiny was eventually suppressed, it became a lasting symbol of defiance against tyranny. Throughout the summer and autumn, unrest continued to spread. Universities closed as students joined demonstrations. In Poland, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus, nationalist uprisings broke out, demanding independence from Russian rule. The empire was fracturing along social, political, and ethnic lines. For the first time in his reign, Nicholas II faced the possibility of complete collapse. His ministers advised reform, arguing that concessions were necessary to save the monarchy. The Tsar hesitated, torn between fear of revolution and his belief in divine authority. His hesitation only made matters worse. In October 1905, a general strike swept through the empire. Telegraph lines went silent, trains stopped running, and factories shut down. The strike became a nationwide paralysis, the largest the world had yet seen. Even the newspapers could not print. The empire's entire system seemed to have come to a halt. Under growing pressure, Nicholas II finally acted. On October 17th, he issued a document known as the October Manifesto. It promised freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, as well as the creation of an elected parliament, the Duma. For many Russians, this seemed like the beginning of a new era. Crowds cheered in the streets, celebrating what appeared to be the birth of a constitutional monarchy in Russia. But the hope did not last. The promises of the October Manifesto were soon betrayed. The Tsar and his advisors saw the reforms as temporary measures to calm the public, not as real changes to the system. When the Duma met for the first time in 1906 and began to criticize the government, Nicholas dissolved it. He issued new election laws that ensured conservative dominance. Censorship returned, and revolutionary leaders were arrested or exiled. In rural areas, the army was sent to crush peasant uprisings with brutal efficiency. Villages suspected of rebellion were burned. Public hangings became common, earning the gallows the grim nickname Stolypin's necktie after the Tsar's prime minister. By the end of 1906, the First Russian Revolution had been defeated. The strikes ended, and the Soviets were dismantled. The Potemkin was scuttled. The Tsar had survived. Yet nothing was as it had been before. The events of 1905 had left a permanent scar on Russian society. The belief in the sacred bond between ruler and people had been broken forever. The peasants, workers, and soldiers who had once believed in the Tsar's divine mission now saw his rule as a source of suffering. The Duma, though weak, had introduced the idea of representation into Russian political life. Underground movements, though crushed, had tasted the possibility of revolution. The Tsar had restored order, but the foundations of that order were cracked. The winter that followed was quieter than the last, but beneath the calm, anger still burned. Russia had seen the power of its own people, and the memory of Bloody Sunday would not fade. The next decade would bring reforms and repression, progress and despair, But the question that had haunted the empire remained unanswered. Could autocracy survive in the modern world? The events of 1905 had shown that the people of Russia were no longer afraid to challenge the crown. What had begun with blood on the snow would one day return as a storm far greater than anyone in 1905 could imagine. The empire had survived its first tremor, but the ground beneath it was still moving, slowly and relentlessly, toward the next eruption. The failure of the 1905 revolution had given Russia a temporary calm, but not peace. Beneath the illusion of stability, deep fractures remained within the empire's body. The concessions Nicholas II had granted, the Duma, limited press freedom, and minor reforms, did not change the autocratic character of his rule. Peasants still toiled under poverty. Urban workers labored in unsafe factories, and soldiers endured discipline that bordered on cruelty. The Tsar's advisors urged him to modernize or risk another upheaval, but he saw reform as weakness. Russia entered the new century carrying its old burdens: inequality, censorship, and the fragile pride of an empire that had not yet accepted its decline. When Europe drifted toward war in 1914, Russia followed with confidence in its faith and its army, unaware that this war would destroy the old order completely. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited the alliances that pulled all of Europe into conflict. When Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914, crowds in St. Petersburg filled the streets with patriotic chants. The city was renamed Petrograd to sound less German, and men enlisted in their millions. For a brief moment, it seemed that Russia had rediscovered its unity. Yet this unity was fragile, built on emotion, not preparation. The empire entered the war with limited ammunition, poor logistics, and an army stretched across vast distances. Many soldiers marched to the front without boots or rifles, relying on faith that the state would provide. The Russian command underestimated the modernity of the German army. Within weeks, the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 turned into a disaster. General Samsonov's army was encircled and destroyed. Over 70,000 men were killed or captured. The defeat stunned the empire and shattered morale at home. In Petrograd, the mood shifted from patriotic pride to uncertainty. Rumors spread of German spies in the court, and whispers accused Empress Alexandra, herself of German descent, of sympathizing with the enemy. The credibility of the monarchy began to crumble. As 1915 unfolded, the war revealed the empire's weaknesses. Supply chains broke down, railways were overburdened, and soldiers often went hungry. Industrial workers in Petrograd faced food shortages, rising prices, and 12-hour shifts to meet military production demands. The Duma called for reform and cooperation with the government, but Nicholas II rejected any advice that questioned his divine authority. He dissolved sessions, ignored ministers, and replaced generals without strategy. His decision in September 1915 to personally command the army from the front removed him from governance and left the capital under the influence of Empress Alexandra and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's growing presence at court damaged the monarchy's reputation further. A mystic and faith healer, he claimed to ease the suffering of the Tsar's son, Alexei, who was afflicted with hemophilia. His success gave him access to the royal family, but his behavior, drunkenness, political interference, and alleged corruption turned him into a symbol of decay. Politicians, nobles, and ordinary citizens alike saw Rasputin as proof that the Tsar was blind to his nation's suffering. The war continued to drain resources, and inflation spiraled. By 1916, food queues stretched across cities, and railway lines could no longer deliver grain efficiently. At the front, morale collapsed. Soldiers began to desert in growing numbers. Many officers were killed or replaced with inexperienced recruits. The Russian army, once imagined as limitless, was slowly disintegrating. Casualty numbers rose into the millions. News from the front was censored, but letters from soldiers revealed despair. They fought without purpose, unsure why they were dying for a regime that ignored their families' hunger. In December 1916, a group of nobles led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich assassinated Rasputin, believing his death would save the empire. Yet his removal did nothing to repair the state. Instead, it exposed the desperation of the elite and their loss of confidence in the Tsar. Nicholas II remained at the front, detached from the crisis, issuing orders that no longer mattered. The machinery of the empire, its bureaucracy, army, and economy, was falling apart. By early 1917, the situation reached a breaking point. The winter was harsh, fuel shortages crippled transport, and bread rations were cut. In Petrograd, factories shut down as workers went on strike, demanding food and better wages. Women queued for hours in freezing conditions. On March 8, 1917, what began as a protest on International Women's Day grew into a mass demonstration. Within days, tens of thousands filled the streets, shouting for bread, peace, and freedom. The police could not contain them. Many soldiers refused to fire on the crowds and joined the protesters instead. The mutiny spread rapidly. Regiments abandoned their posts, armed workers seized weapons depots, and revolutionary committees re-emerged in the city. The government collapsed. When Nicholas tried to return from the front, his train was stopped by mutinous soldiers. Realizing his authority was gone, he abdicated on March 15, 1917. Over 300 years of Romanov rule ended in silence, without ceremony, in a railway carriage. In Petrograd, power passed to the Duma, which formed a provisional government. At the same time, the Petrograd Soviet, a council representing workers and soldiers, revived itself, claiming to speak for the people. Russia now had two centers of power, neither fully legitimate nor stable. The provisional government promised democracy, civil rights, and continuation of the war alongside the Allies. The Soviet demanded peace, land, and bread. Between them lay a vacuum that would soon be filled by new forces. The fall of the Tsar did not end Russia's crisis, it deepened it. Across the empire, peasants seized land from landlords, national minorities demanded autonomy, and soldiers deserted the front in droves. The collapse of censorship unleashed a flood of political activity. Parties, newspapers, and movements emerged overnight. Among them, the Bolsheviks, a small faction led by Vladimir Lenin, began to reorganize. Exiled in Switzerland since 1907, Lenin followed the events through foreign newspapers and saw in the chaos an opportunity. For him, the February Revolution had removed the monarchy but left the bourgeois state intact. True revolution, he believed, would come only when the workers themselves seized power. In April 1917, with German assistance, Lenin returned to Petrograd in a sealed train. His arrival electrified the revolutionary movement. At Finland Station, he declared that the war must end immediately, that all land should belong to the peasants, and that power must pass to the Soviets. Many dismissed him as unrealistic, but his message resonated with exhausted soldiers and workers. The slogan "Peace, Land, and Bread" spread across the country. The provisional government struggled to maintain control. It continued the war effort, launching the failed June offensive that led to massive casualties and renewed desertions. Inflation worsened, and the authority of the state weakened. In the countryside, peasants no longer waited for permission to take land. They simply occupied it. The army was disintegrating, and cities were on the verge of famine. The dream of liberal democracy that had briefly emerged in March was collapsing under the weight of war and hunger. As summer turned to autumn, the question of power returned with urgency. The Soviet and the provisional government coexisted uneasily, each claiming to represent the people. Between them stood millions of soldiers, peasants, and workers, disillusioned with promises that never materialized. The revolution that had begun with a cry for bread and liberty was now moving toward its second, more radical phase, one that would reshape not only Russia but the entire modern world. The story now turns to that moment when the fragile balance of 1917 gave way to confrontation. The October Revolution, when Lenin and his followers seized the chance to transform chaos into a new order. As 1914 unfolded, Europe descended into the largest conflict the world had yet seen. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had ignited a chain of alliances, pulling nations into war. Russia, bound by treaty obligations to Serbia, mobilized against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Patriotic fervor swept the cities, and men enlisted in vast numbers. The Russian army, once the pride of the empire, marched toward the front lines with confidence in its strength and in the Tsar's guidance. Petrograd, still reeling from the unresolved tensions of 1905, celebrated parades and rallies, imagining unity and honor in the defense of the Slavic nations. Yet beneath the surface, the empire was unprepared. Industrialization had progressed unevenly, and while factories produced weapons, they could not supply the massive demands of an army mobilizing millions. Railways strained under the weight of supplies and troops. Communication across the vast empire was slow, leaving commanders isolated and decision-making fragmented. In August 1914, the Russian army faced its first major test at the Battle of Tannenberg against German forces. Poor planning, weak logistics, and miscommunication led to disaster. The Second Army, commanded by General Samsonov, was encircled and annihilated, with over 70,000 soldiers killed or captured. The defeat shocked the nation. Newspapers cautiously reported the losses, but soldiers' letters and rumors carried the truth. Confidence in the army's competence eroded, and faith in the Tsar's ability to lead began to falter. The initial wave of patriotism was replaced by uncertainty and fear. Ordinary citizens began questioning the competence of the monarchy and its ministers, who appeared unable to manage a modern war. The Russian military struggled throughout 1915. Soldiers faced shortages of rifles, ammunition, boots, and food. Many marched to battle barefoot or sharing a single rifle between two men. Commanders were often poorly trained, relying on outdated tactics that led to catastrophic casualties. At home, industrial workers faced rising prices and inflation. Food became increasingly scarce, with long lines forming outside bakeries and markets. Necessities were hard to obtain, and wages failed to keep pace with the rising cost of living. Urban workers, already frustrated by long hours and dangerous working conditions, now faced hunger in addition to labor exploitation. Social tension intensified, and strikes became more frequent. Factories shut down, railways slowed, and the government's capacity to respond was limited. Nicholas II, convinced that his divine right justified absolute control, made a critical decision in September 1915. He assumed personal command of the Russian armies at the front. By doing so, he removed himself from the day-to-day governance of Petrograd, leaving the capital under the influence of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. Alexandra, deeply devoted to her family and guided by her faith, was easily swayed by the guidance of the monk Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin, a mystic and faith healer, had gained extraordinary influence over the royal family due to his alleged ability to treat the hemophilia of the Tsar's son, Alexei. His presence at court caused a scandal, undermining the monarchy's credibility. Reports of his immoral behavior, political interference, and close ties to government ministers fueled public distrust. Letters, rumors, and newspaper articles circulated that painted the royal family as detached and incompetent. As 1916 progressed, the situation in Russia deteriorated further. Soldiers' morale collapsed. Desertion became common, and units abandoned their posts. The army's defeats and disorganization led to staggering casualties, with millions killed, wounded, or missing. In the cities, shortages worsened. Fuel and coal were in short supply, causing industries to slow or shut down entirely. Inflation skyrocketed, making basic commodities unaffordable for the working class. Strikes and protests became routine as workers demanded better pay, food, and relief from unbearable conditions. Social unrest spread from the industrial centers to smaller towns and villages, where peasants were increasingly emboldened to challenge local authorities. The assassination of Rasputin in December 1916 by a group of nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, reflected the desperation of Russia's elite. They believed that removing Rasputin would restore confidence in the monarchy and stabilize the empire. Yet the murder only highlighted the deep instability of the regime. Nicholas II remained at the front, isolated and increasingly powerless. Ministers argued over policy, yet few dared challenge the Tsar directly. His absence from the capital created a vacuum of authority, and Alexandra, heavily influenced by Rasputin before his death, was mistrusted by both the Duma and the population. Political paralysis, combined with social and economic strain, pushed Russia toward the edge of collapse. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly harsh. Severe weather compounded food shortages, and urban populations faced long waits for bread and fuel. Petrograd became a city of tension, where workers, soldiers, and citizens felt abandoned by the monarchy. Women, who had been the backbone of urban households, began demonstrating for bread and necessities. The combination of hunger, exhaustion, and political frustration created conditions ripe for revolution. Factories were quieting as strikes spread, and the railways, essential for food distribution, were overwhelmed. The city teetered on the brink of chaos. The February Revolution of 1917 emerged directly from these conditions. On March 8th, women in Petrograd marched to demand bread, joined by thousands of workers. Strikes escalated, and the protests swelled into a mass movement that shut down much of the city. Police and military units, faced with large crowds and exhausted by years of war and mismanagement, often refused to enforce order. Soldiers increasingly joined the protesters, refusing to fire on civilians. This convergence of economic hardship, military disillusionment, and political weakness created a moment when the monarchy could no longer sustain itself. As unrest spread across Petrograd, Nicholas II attempted to return to the capital to reassert authority. His train was stopped by soldiers, many of whom sympathized with the demonstrators. Recognizing the futility of resistance, the Tsar abdicated on March 15, 1917. This marked the end of over 300 years of Romanov rule. The abdication was quiet and bureaucratic, carried out in a railway carriage, yet its significance was monumental. A centuries-old autocracy had collapsed under the pressures of war, economic mismanagement, and political isolation. In the aftermath, the Duma established a provisional government to assume authority and maintain order. Simultaneously, the Petrograd Soviet reasserted itself as a body representing workers and soldiers. Russia now had two centers of power, one seeking to implement moderate reforms and continue the war, the other demanding radical change and immediate peace. Between them existed the broader population of soldiers, peasants, and workers, many exhausted by war, poverty, and hunger. The February Revolution had removed the Tsar, but it had not resolved the crises that had produced unrest. Social and political instability remained rampant, and the empire teetered on the edge of further upheaval. As 1916 ended and 1917 began, the empire faced an uncertain future. Millions of soldiers were at the front, millions of citizens in cities faced hunger, and millions of peasants were seizing land without authorization. The collapse of authority, combined with the failure of the Tsar to maintain effective governance, left Russia vulnerable to more radical movements. Among them, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were poised to take advantage of the chaos. The collapse of the old order, accelerated by war and incompetence, had created conditions in which a new political force could seize power. The February Revolution was only the beginning. The empire's decay had set the stage for the October Revolution, which would soon follow. The story of Russia in 1914 to 1916 demonstrates how prolonged war, poor governance, and social inequality can weaken even the largest empires. The mistakes of the Tsar, the failures of the military, and the suffering of the population combined to produce a moment when the old structures of authority were no longer sustainable. By early 1917, the empire had been transformed, its people tested by hunger and loss, its institutions paralyzed, and its monarchy dissolved. The collapse of imperial authority was complete, and the country faced a revolutionary future whose consequences would reshape the 20th century. By the early months of 1917, the Russian Empire was on the edge of collapse. The strains of World War I had exposed the inefficiency of the government, the inadequacy of the military, and the desperation of the population. Factories had closed, food was scarce, and soldiers returning from the front brought stories of defeat, hunger, and disease. Petrograd, once a center of industry and culture, had become a city in crisis. Women, burdened by long queues for bread and essential goods, began to organize and demand immediate relief. Their protests, initially focused on food shortages, quickly attracted thousands of workers from factories and industries across the city. Streets that had once been orderly and monitored by police forces were now filled with people shouting for change. The authorities, already weakened and demoralized, struggled to contain the unrest. The protests escalated rapidly. What began on March 8, 1917, as a strike and demonstration by women demanding bread expanded into a mass movement encompassing the entire urban workforce. The streets of Petrograd were crowded with men and women marching in unity. Workers left factories and seized control of key industrial sites, disrupting production and communication networks. Soldiers, many of whom were exhausted and demoralized after years of frontline service, faced a difficult choice. When ordered to fire upon the demonstrators, some units refused. Others joined the protests outright. The authority of the Tsar, already weakened by absence and mismanagement, had eroded to the point where his orders were ignored or openly defied. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II formally abdicated the throne. He renounced power first for himself and then for his son, Alexei, effectively ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The abdication was not accompanied by fanfare or ceremony. It occurred quietly in a railway carriage outside Petrograd, yet its implications were profound. The monarchy, once considered inviolable and divinely sanctioned, had fallen in a matter of weeks. The abdication marked the first time in centuries that Russia would attempt self-governance without a czar at the helm. For the population, this was both a moment of hope and uncertainty. The collapse of imperial authority created a power vacuum, exposing the empire to competing forces vying for control. Immediately following the abdication, the Duma, which had been established following the failed 1905 revolution but largely sidelined in practice, assumed authority. It formed the Provisional Government, a coalition of liberal and moderate political figures intended to stabilize the state, manage the war effort, and establish democratic reforms. The Provisional Government promised to implement civil liberties, freedom of the press, and representative governance. However, it faced the significant challenge of legitimacy. While it claimed authority based on the mandate of the Duma, it had limited control over the military and urban centers, many of which were dominated by revolutionary councils known as Soviets. These Soviets, particularly the Petrograd Soviet, represented workers, soldiers, and peasants and had their own mechanisms for enforcing decisions, often conflicting with the directives of the provisional government. The coexistence of two centers of power created a dual authority system. The provisional government sought to continue the war against Germany, adhering to agreements with the Allies and hoping to maintain Russia's international standing. Meanwhile, the Petrograd Soviet advocated for immediate peace, redistribution of land, and empowerment of workers and soldiers through councils and committees. This division complicated governance and created tension throughout the empire. Soldiers returning from the front were increasingly influenced by the Soviets, and urban workers looked to them for guidance on strikes, distribution of food, and political action. The provisional government's inability to assert clear authority highlighted the fragility of Russia's new political order. Peasant uprisings spread across rural regions. Land seizures increased as local populations acted independently, taking land from landlords and redistributing it without waiting for legislation from the central government. These actions reflected long-standing grievances dating back to serfdom and were accelerated by the weakening of state authority. While the provisional government attempted to regulate or mediate these conflicts, its limited reach in the countryside made enforcement difficult. Meanwhile, national minorities within the empire, including Poles, Ukrainians, and Finns, saw the collapse of central authority as an opportunity to assert autonomy or independence. The empire, which had survived centuries through strict hierarchical control and centralized governance, was unraveling from both urban and rural pressures simultaneously. Within Petrograd, the revolutionary environment fostered the reorganization of political groups and parties. Among these, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, emerged as a radical force advocating immediate withdrawal from the war, transfer of land to peasants, and the transfer of power to the Soviets. Lenin, who had returned from exile in Switzerland earlier in 1917 with German assistance, used the slogans peace, land, and bread to resonate with the war-weary population. His presence and speeches provided direction for workers and soldiers frustrated with indecision and scarcity. Lenin rejected compromise with the provisional government, which he viewed as an interim authority maintaining capitalist and bourgeois interests, and instead called for a full socialist transformation. The provisional government struggled to assert control over the military. Desertions increased along the front lines, and soldiers demanded immediate demobilization or significant reforms. The military, previously a pillar of the Tsar's power, was now unreliable and divided in loyalty between traditional commanders, revolutionary councils, and political parties advocating different approaches. The failure to address immediate needs, such as food, clothing, and payment, exacerbated discontent. Efforts by the government to maintain the war effort were met with resistance both at the front and in cities supplying troops, contributing to further instability. During this period, the press and public opinion played an increasingly central role. Newspapers, previously subject to strict censorship, reported openly on shortages, demonstrations, and military failures. Political pamphlets circulated widely, increasing awareness of socialist, liberal, and nationalist positions. Workers' and soldiers' councils issued statements, controlled local resources, and negotiated with factory management and military units. The combination of an active media environment, decentralized authority, and widespread dissatisfaction created a volatile political landscape in which small incidents could rapidly escalate into broader crises. The Petrograd Soviet, composed primarily of workers' representatives and soldiers' deputies, became a parallel government. It organized militias, regulated the distribution of food, and issued directives that affected both civilians and soldiers. Its influence often surpassed that of the provisional government in practical terms. Workers and soldiers increasingly relied on the Soviet government for decisions on wages, rations, and security. This dual authority created an environment in which legality and power were distinct. The provisional government had formal recognition, while the Soviet exercised actual control over daily life. By mid-1917, Russia had entered a transitional phase characterized by uncertainty, political experimentation, and social unrest. The abdication of Nicholas II removed the monarchy as a unifying institution, but did not replace it with a coherent system capable of addressing the immediate crises of war, hunger, and land reform. The Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet represented competing visions for the future, each drawing support from different sectors of society. Lenin and the Bolsheviks recognized the weaknesses inherent in this dual authority and prepared to leverage them to seize power. The period following the fall of the Romanovs illustrates the interplay of social, political, and military factors in a revolutionary environment. The combination of prolonged war, economic disruption, and weak governance created conditions that allowed radical groups to gain traction. Soldiers, workers, and peasants, disillusioned by repeated failures and scarcity, became active participants in shaping the direction of the state. The provisional government's inability to consolidate power demonstrated the challenges of establishing authority after the collapse of a long-standing autocracy. The abdication of Nicholas II, the establishment of the provisional government, and the re-emergence of the Petrograd Soviet collectively marked the conclusion of the first phase of revolution in Russia. This period set the stage for the subsequent radicalization that would culminate in the October Revolution. The dual authority system, widespread social unrest, and continued military failures created a situation in which decisive action by a determined revolutionary faction became increasingly feasible. Russia's political landscape, transformed by abdication and revolution, was poised for a shift from provisional governance to Bolshevik control. In sum, the February Revolution represents the collapse of imperial authority and the emergence of a fragile, contested state. It highlights the critical role of social unrest, military disintegration, and political inexperience in shaping the trajectory of revolutionary change. The provisional government's promise of democracy, while symbolically significant, was insufficient to stabilize the country or resolve the pressing crises of war and scarcity. Meanwhile, the Soviets provided practical control and ideological direction to large segments of the population. This environment created the conditions for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to challenge the existing order, eventually leading to the radical transformation of Russian governance in October 1917. The events of March 1917 link directly to the next phase of the revolution, as radical elements, dissatisfied with the provisional government's performance, prepared to consolidate power and reshape the state according to socialist principles. The collapse of the monarchy, the failure of moderate governance, and the widespread demand for peace and reform created a revolutionary momentum that would not be contained. In April 1917, a train traveled across Germany, carrying a man who would soon transform the political landscape of Russia. Inside was Vladimir Lenin, returning from years of exile in Switzerland. The German government, engaged in war against Russia, permitted Lenin to pass through its territory, hoping that his presence would further destabilize the Russian state. Lenin arrived in Petrograd with a clear and uncompromising vision for the country. He addressed crowds at Finland Station, articulating the ideas that would define the next stage of the revolution. His slogans, peace, land, and bread, summarized the desires of soldiers, workers, and peasants who had endured years of deprivation and war. He demanded the immediate withdrawal of Russia from the ongoing conflict, the transfer of land to the peasants, and the authority of governance to be placed in the hands of the Soviets. His message was simple, direct, and resonant with the exhausted population. Lenin's arrival intensified divisions within the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky. The government faced the impossible task of maintaining the war effort while addressing widespread social unrest. The June offensive, an attempt to strengthen Russia's position on the front, failed disastrously, resulting in massive casualties and desertions. Soldiers, increasingly disillusioned, began abandoning their posts, undermining the authority of both military leaders and the provisional government. Food shortages persisted, factories slowed or shut down, and urban populations faced increasingly desperate conditions. The provisional government's inability to address these crises eroded public confidence and opened the door for more radical solutions. Meanwhile, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were gaining influence through the Soviets. The Petrograd Soviet, composed of workers and soldiers, increasingly aligned with Bolshevik ideas, organizing strikes, demonstrations, and political campaigns. Lenin emphasized that the provisional government represented bourgeois interests and that true power lay with the workers and soldiers. He rejected compromise, advocating instead for a revolutionary seizure of authority. His speeches, articles, and directives were widely circulated, providing clarity to those who had been uncertain about the next step. Bolshevik newspapers and pamphlets proliferated, explaining policies, criticizing the government, and offering guidance to factory committees, soldier councils, and local Soviets. In July 1917, discontent erupted into action. Armed workers and soldiers took to the streets in what became known as the July Days. They protested against continued participation in the war and the failure of the provisional government to implement promised reforms. Initially, the uprising appeared spontaneous, driven by frustration and desperation. The government responded with force, and the revolt was suppressed. Key Bolshevik leaders were arrested or forced to flee, and Lenin retreated to Finland to avoid capture. Despite the failure, the July Days revealed the weaknesses of the provisional government and the growing appeal of radical politics among soldiers and workers. It also demonstrated the organizational capacity of the Bolsheviks, who, even in temporary retreat, continued to influence political developments. The summer months of 1917 saw the continuation of social unrest, food riots, and labor strikes. Industrial production remained disrupted, and soldiers returning from the front demanded reforms and immediate peace. The provisional government, still committed to the war, struggled to maintain control. Kerensky attempted to negotiate with moderate socialist groups, but these efforts failed to stabilize the situation. Peasants in the countryside continued to seize land without authorization, further undermining central authority. Regional authorities were unable to enforce the government's directives, leaving rural areas largely autonomous. The combination of urban unrest, military disintegration, and peasant action created an environment in which radical forces could gain support rapidly. Lenin recognized that the time was approaching to act decisively. He returned to Petrograd in October 1917, strategically positioning the Bolsheviks to exploit the provisional government's vulnerabilities. The party had expanded its influence within the Soviets and established Red Guards, organized militias capable of coordinated action. Lenin emphasized careful planning, ensuring that when the moment arrived, the Bolsheviks could seize key positions without unnecessary bloodshed. Political propaganda, organizational networks, and disciplined leadership provided the foundation for the next stage of revolution. The contrast between the indecision of the provisional government and the clarity of the Bolshevik plan became increasingly apparent to the population. Throughout this period, the relationship between the urban population, the military, and revolutionary organizations was critical. Soldiers, particularly those stationed in Petrograd, were exposed to Bolshevik ideas through committees, newspapers, and political meetings. Workers, frustrated by shortages, inflation, and unsafe conditions, responded to Lenin's message that the existing government could not meet their needs. The alignment of these groups under Bolshevik influence created the social and political infrastructure necessary for the seizure of power. Lenin's insistence on immediate action and his rejection of compromise distinguished the Bolsheviks from other socialist factions, such as the Mensheviks, who advocated gradual reform and cooperation with the provisional government. By autumn 1917, the situation in Russia had deteriorated to a critical point. The provisional government remained weak and divided, continuing the war while failing to address urban and rural crises. Soldiers deserted or joined the Soviets, workers organized strikes and demonstrations, and peasants seized land without oversight. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, organized and ideologically committed, were prepared to act decisively. The failure of the July days had clarified tactics and allowed the party to strengthen its position. Red Guards controlled access to key points in the city, communication networks were monitored, and loyal Soviet committees coordinated logistics and planning. The convergence of military, political, and social factors created a unique historical moment in which a well-organized revolutionary group could effectively challenge and replace existing authority. Lenin's strategy emphasized speed and precision. Unlike previous uprisings, the October Revolution would not rely on spontaneous demonstrations alone. Red Guards were instructed to seize control of transportation hubs, government buildings, and communication centers. Coordination with sympathetic soldiers ensured that the provisional government's capacity to resist would be minimal. The revolutionary message, withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land, and transfer of power to Soviets, appealed directly to the population's immediate needs, making resistance politically and socially untenable. The planning and ideological clarity provided by Lenin created conditions in which the provisional government was unable to respond effectively, despite retaining nominal authority. The months leading up to the October Revolution illustrate the culmination of forces building since the abdication of Nicholas II. Social unrest, war fatigue, economic collapse, and political disorganization combined to create an environment conducive to radical change. Lenin's return in April and his leadership in the following months provided the organizational framework and ideological justification for action. The failures of the provisional government, from the continued prosecution of the war to the inability to address pressing social issues, reinforced the perception that only the Bolsheviks could fulfill the promises of the revolution. By October 1917, Petrograd was prepared for decisive action. Lenin's influence, the organization of the Red Guards, and the alignment of Soviets with Bolshevik policies positioned the party to take control efficiently. The groundwork laid since his return in April, including speeches, publications, and coordination with urban and military groups, ensured that when the moment arrived, the seizure of power could occur with minimal resistance and maximal legitimacy in the eyes of workers and soldiers. This period, from Lenin's return in April to the eve of the October Revolution, represents a critical phase in the Russian Revolution. It links directly to the previous collapse of imperial authority and the failures of the provisional government. The organizational clarity, ideological focus, and strategic planning of Lenin and the Bolsheviks transformed popular dissatisfaction into coordinated revolutionary action. The combination of social unrest, military collapse, and political disintegration created the conditions for a revolutionary shift in governance, setting the stage for the October Revolution and the establishment of Bolshevik authority. On the night of October 25, 1917, the political tension that had been building for months in Petrograd reached its peak. The Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and the organizational direction of Leon Trotsky, began executing a meticulously planned takeover of the city's key infrastructure. Red Guards, composed of armed workers loyal to the Bolshevik cause, secured strategic locations such as bridges, railway stations, telegraph offices, and government buildings. The movement was not spontaneous. It was the result of careful coordination among Bolshevik leaders who had spent months consolidating influence within the Soviets and mobilizing popular support. Unlike previous uprisings, this action relied on planning, discipline, and the calculated deployment of force to minimize unnecessary resistance. By early morning, the Red Guards had effectively isolated central Petrograd, controlling communication lines and transportation routes. The Winter Palace, the symbolic center of the provisional government, became the focal point of the operation. The ministers of the government, led by Alexander Kerensky, were aware of the advancing forces but lacked the capacity to mount an effective defense. The palace was surrounded, and key entrances were secured by Bolshevik forces. The operation was conducted with minimal violence. The bulk of the provisional government personnel were arrested without organized resistance. This efficiency reflected both the strategic planning of the Bolsheviks and the weakened state of the government, which had failed to establish loyal military defenses or maintain the support of the urban population. The seizure of the Winter Palace marked the effective end of the provisional government. The authority of moderate socialists and liberal politicians collapsed, unable to respond to the decisive action of a coordinated revolutionary force. Lenin's leadership provided a clear ideological framework for the takeover. The slogans of peace, land, and bread resonated with soldiers, workers, and peasants, offering immediate solutions to the crises that had persisted under both the monarchy and the provisional government. Lenin's vision emphasized the transfer of power to the Soviets, positioning them as the legitimate representatives of the people. The October Revolution thus represented both a political and ideological transformation, consolidating control under a socialist framework. Once the Winter Palace was secured, the Bolsheviks moved quickly to establish a new governing structure. Lenin announced the formation of the Council of People's Commissars, a cabinet of Bolshevik leaders who would direct the administration of state affairs. This council immediately assumed control of government functions, including law enforcement, communications, transportation, and distribution of resources. One of the first actions of the new regime was the negotiation of Russia's exit from World War I. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, ceded significant territory to Germany, but allowed the Bolsheviks to redirect attention to domestic stabilization and the consolidation of power. The decision to withdraw from the war was contentious, provoking both support and opposition within Russia, but it addressed the urgent demand for peace among soldiers and civilians alike. The Bolshevik takeover had immediate social and political consequences. In cities, workers and soldiers responded to new directives issued by Soviet committees aligned with Bolshevik policies. Land reform became a priority in rural areas, as decrees redistributed estates previously controlled by nobles to local peasants. The changes, while radical, were generally accepted by the population, who saw them as corrective measures to long-standing social inequities. Simultaneously, the new government faced resistance from those loyal to the former provisional government, moderate socialists, and various anti-Bolshevik factions. This opposition set the stage for a prolonged struggle to consolidate control over the country. The October Revolution demonstrated the significance of timing and preparation in revolutionary success. The Bolsheviks had studied the failures of earlier uprisings, including the July Days, and adjusted their approach accordingly. They relied on disciplined militias, communication networks, and alliances with sympathetic Soviets to ensure coordinated action. By contrast, the provisional government suffered from indecision, lack of military support, and inability to address popular grievances effectively. The contrast between the two sides highlighted the importance of organizational structure and popular legitimacy in achieving political objectives. Immediately following the takeover, Lenin and the Council of People's Commissars began implementing policies to secure the new government. Political opposition was monitored, and counter-revolutionary activities were identified and suppressed. Committees were established to oversee food distribution, public order, and industrial production. Propaganda played a critical role in legitimizing the new authority, explaining policy decisions, and mobilizing support among urban workers, soldiers, and rural peasants. The early months of Bolshevik governance involved both the consolidation of power and the management of urgent social, economic, and political crises. The October Revolution also had immediate international repercussions. The withdrawal from World War I and the establishment of a socialist state challenged the strategic interests of the Allied powers. Britain, France, and the United States, along with Germany and other neighboring countries, closely monitored developments in Russia. The Bolsheviks' promises of social reform and redistribution raised concern among conservative and capitalist governments, who feared the spread of revolutionary movements within their own borders. Russia, previously a monarchy with established diplomatic and military alliances, had transformed overnight into a radical state with a new political and economic vision. Within Russia, the response to the October Revolution was mixed. Many urban workers and soldiers welcomed the change, viewing it as a necessary solution to years of deprivation, war, and ineffective governance. Peasants in rural regions largely supported the redistribution of land and the collapse of old hierarchies. However, segments of the population, including former government officials, moderate socialists, and those loyal to the monarchy, opposed the Bolsheviks. This division set the stage for the Russian Civil War, which would erupt in 1918 as various factions, collectively referred to as the Whites, challenged Bolshevik authority. The revolution, while successful in seizing power, did not immediately unify the country under a single government. The October Revolution's impact extended beyond politics to social and economic structures. Factories, previously under limited worker control, were reorganized according to Bolshevik principles. Land reform was implemented across large estates, transferring property to local communities. Education, public services, and communication networks were gradually brought under centralized control. These reforms, while radical, reflected the ideological goals of the Bolsheviks and addressed demands that had persisted since the fall of the monarchy. They also established the foundation for future policies under Lenin's leadership and the subsequent consolidation of the Soviet state. The consolidation of power after October involved strategic management of potential threats. Bolsheviks established committees to monitor dissent, enforce labor regulations, and maintain security. Opposition parties were allowed limited activity initially, but as the new government sought to stabilize authority, restrictions increased. The Red Guards and loyal soldiers provided enforcement capability, ensuring compliance with directives from the Council of People's Commissars. This combination of administrative control and military support allowed the Bolsheviks to maintain authority in urban centers while preparing to expand influence throughout the country. The October Revolution represented both a culmination of long-standing social and political discontent and a decisive intervention by a well-organized revolutionary party. The fall of the provisional government, the seizure of the Winter Palace, and the establishment of Bolshevik authority marked a transformation in the structure of power in Russia. Lenin's leadership provided ideological coherence, while Trotsky's organizational direction ensured the effective execution of the takeover. The revolution addressed immediate popular demands, including peace, land reform, and social stability, while establishing mechanisms for long-term political control. In retrospect, the October Revolution can be seen as a direct consequence of preceding events. The failures of the monarchy during World War I, the inadequacies of the provisional government, and the widespread social and economic hardships affecting soldiers, workers, and peasants. Each phase built upon the previous one, creating conditions in which a disciplined, ideologically committed party could seize control effectively. The revolution exemplified the interaction of social, political, and military factors in shaping historical outcomes. The events of October 1917 are directly linked to the next phase of Russian history, the Russian Civil War. The seizure of power by the Bolsheviks, while successful in the immediate term, provoked resistance from multiple factions, including monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and foreign powers. The consolidation of Bolshevik authority required not only political maneuvering but also military action, organizational discipline, and the continued support of workers, soldiers, and peasants. The October Revolution thus serves as both a turning point in the Russian Revolution and a prelude to a period of intense conflict and transformation, during which the foundations of the Soviet state would be established and defended against internal and external opposition. Following the October Revolution, Russia descended into a period of intense conflict that would define the first years of Bolshevik rule. The seizure of power by the Bolsheviks was not universally accepted. Opposition emerged almost immediately from a coalition of forces known collectively as the Whites, which included monarchists seeking a return of the Romanov dynasty, liberal reformers opposed to Bolshevik socialism, moderate socialists dissatisfied with Lenin's policies, and regional leaders asserting autonomy. Foreign governments, including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, intervened with material support for anti-Bolshevik forces, motivated by strategic concerns and fear of the spread of socialism. The result was a brutal and multifaceted civil war that engulfed the country from 1918 to 1921, reshaping the political, social, and economic landscape of Russia. The initial months of conflict saw the Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, mobilize rapidly and efficiently. Trotsky, previously an organizer of the Petrograd Soviet and the October Revolution, applied strict military discipline and centralized command to create a force capable of countering multiple threats simultaneously. The army incorporated workers and peasants loyal to the Bolsheviks, as well as former soldiers who had been persuaded to support the new government. Political commissars were assigned to units to ensure ideological loyalty, enforce discipline, and maintain morale. The Red Army's organizational structure combined military efficiency with ideological commitment, enabling it to operate under challenging conditions, including harsh winter weather, limited supplies, and disrupted transportation networks. Opposing forces, while numerically significant in some regions, lacked cohesion and coordination. The White armies were divided along political, regional, and strategic lines, preventing a unified approach to defeating the Bolsheviks. Command structures were inconsistent, communication between forces was limited, and internal rivalries weakened operational effectiveness. Foreign support, while valuable in terms of weapons, supplies, and advisory personnel, could not compensate for the lack of strategic unity. This fragmentation of opposition provided the Bolsheviks with opportunities to concentrate forces, exploit weaknesses, and gradually expand control over contested territories. The Civil War had devastating effects on the civilian population. Urban centers faced food shortages, disrupted industry, and repeated occupation by opposing forces. Peasants in rural areas were subjected to requisitioning, forced conscription, and violent reprisals by both Red and White forces. Disease and famine claimed millions of lives. In 1918, the Bolsheviks implemented policies to requisition grain from peasants to feed the cities and the Red Army, a measure that provoked resistance in many areas. Rural uprisings occurred, sometimes with the support of local white forces, and were suppressed with considerable violence. The scale of destruction and suffering during these years was unprecedented in Russian history, with estimates of total deaths from war, famine, and disease ranging from 5 to 7 million. In July 1918, the conflict reached a significant symbolic and political turning point with the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in Ekaterinburg. The Romanovs, previously held under house arrest, were killed by Bolshevik forces to eliminate any possibility of their return to power and to assert the permanence of Bolshevik authority. The act was controversial but reinforced the revolutionary government's determination to consolidate power and eliminate symbolic threats. International reaction was immediate, with condemnation from monarchies and conservative governments, further intensifying the civil conflict and solidifying ideological divides. Trotsky's leadership proved crucial in transforming the Red Army into a disciplined and effective fighting force. He emphasized strict training, centralization of command, and the integration of political education alongside military instruction. Units were organized to respond flexibly to changing conditions on multiple fronts, and propaganda was used to maintain morale and ideological commitment. The combination of disciplined organization, political oversight, and coordination with Bolshevik administrative structures enabled the Red Army to conduct operations across the vast Russian territory, confronting diverse threats simultaneously. By 1920, the Civil War had reached a critical phase. White forces mounted offensives in the south, north, and east, attempting to capture major cities and strategic locations. However, the lack of coordination, logistical difficulties, and limited popular support hindered their effectiveness. In contrast, the Red Army capitalized on its organizational cohesion and popular mobilization, systematically retaking territory and defeating isolated enemy contingents. Major cities, including Moscow and Petrograd, remained under Bolshevik control, providing administrative and symbolic centers around which revolutionary authority could be reinforced. Economic collapse accompanied the Civil War. Industrial production declined sharply, transportation networks were destroyed, and currency lost value rapidly. The Bolsheviks faced the challenge of maintaining supply lines for both civilian populations and military operations. Requisitioning policies, centralized planning, and administrative oversight were implemented to sustain essential services and support the war effort. While these measures were often harsh and met with resistance, they enabled the Red Army to maintain operational effectiveness and prevent the total collapse of urban centers. Throughout the Civil War, the Bolsheviks consolidated political power by implementing mechanisms of control across occupied territories. Local Soviets were reorganized to ensure loyalty, opposition parties were monitored or suppressed, and propaganda was disseminated to reinforce the legitimacy of Bolshevik rule. The Cheka, the secret police, was established to identify and eliminate counter-revolutionary activity, enforce discipline, and maintain security. This combination of military strength, administrative oversight, and political enforcement allowed the Bolsheviks to establish a durable foundation of authority despite the ongoing conflict. By 1921, the White Armies had been decisively defeated. Fragmented opposition forces either surrendered, retreated, or were eliminated. Bolshevik control extended across the majority of European Russia, while some outlying regions remained unstable or autonomous. The conclusion of the active civil war allowed the Bolsheviks to shift focus toward reconstruction, economic stabilization, and institutional consolidation. The state faced immense challenges, including devastated infrastructure, widespread famine, and social unrest, but the central authority of the Bolsheviks was firmly established. The Civil War's consequences for Russian society were profound. Millions of people had died from combat, disease, and famine. Urban centers were depopulated, with many citizens displaced or killed. Rural areas experienced significant social disruption, with land seizures, forced conscription, and violent repression. Economically, production had collapsed, currency was devalued, and transportation networks were in disrepair. Politically, however, the Bolsheviks emerged as the dominant force, having demonstrated the capacity to organize, enforce authority, and achieve strategic objectives in the face of widespread opposition. The experience of the Civil War reinforced the Bolsheviks' approach to governance. Military discipline, political oversight, and centralized control became central features of the new state. Policies such as land redistribution, nationalization of industry, and the establishment of Soviet authority were implemented to address immediate social demands while reinforcing political control. The combination of ideological commitment and pragmatic measures allowed the Bolsheviks to maintain authority in a society exhausted by years of conflict and deprivation. The execution of the Romanovs, the defeat of the White Armies, and the consolidation of the Red Army created a new political order in Russia. The Bolsheviks had not only seized power in October 1917, but had successfully defended it against multiple internal and external threats. The lessons of the Civil War informed subsequent policies, including the establishment of mechanisms for social control, economic management, and political oversight. The period demonstrated the interplay of military strategy, political organization, and social conditions in determining the success of revolutionary movements. The Russian Civil War is directly linked to the next phase of history: reconstruction and stabilization under Bolshevik authority. By 1921, active military conflict had ended, but the social and economic challenges remained immense. Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced the task of rebuilding an economy devastated by war, famine, and political instability while maintaining political control over a population that had experienced years of extreme hardship. The mechanisms developed during the Civil War, including centralized governance, administrative oversight, and disciplined military and paramilitary forces, provided the foundation for this effort. By 1921, Russia had emerged from years of revolution and civil war, but the country was devastated. The economy was in ruins, cities were partially destroyed, and millions of people had died from fighting, disease, and famine. The social fabric of the nation had been torn apart, leaving families separated, communities in disarray, and widespread suffering among urban and rural populations. The Bolsheviks, having consolidated military and political control, faced the urgent task of rebuilding the country and stabilizing their authority. Lenin recognized that the methods used to win the Civil War, strict central control, requisitioning of resources, and political repression, could not continue indefinitely without risking further unrest and potential collapse of the state. In response, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in March 1921. The NEP was a strategic retreat from the more radical economic measures implemented during war communism. Small businesses were allowed to reopen, peasants could sell surplus crops on the market, and limited private trade was permitted. The policy aimed to restore agricultural production, revive urban industry, and stabilize the currency. It was not a complete abandonment of socialist principles, but rather a pragmatic adjustment intended to address the immediate economic crisis. By providing incentives for peasants and small entrepreneurs, the NEP sought to increase production, improve food supply, and reduce social unrest while maintaining overall Bolshevik political control. The NEP produced measurable results. Agricultural output began to recover as peasants responded to the opportunity to sell surplus grain for profit. Food shortages in cities gradually lessened, and urban populations started to stabilize. Small-scale commerce returned, and some industries resumed operation under private or semi-private management. The policy also helped the Bolsheviks regain legitimacy among the population, as it demonstrated responsiveness to the needs and suffering of ordinary people. Although the NEP was temporary and contained within the broader framework of state control, it represented an important step in transitioning from wartime policies to a sustainable peacetime economy. Despite the NEP's implementation, challenges persisted. Infrastructure remained damaged, communication networks were unreliable, and many regions suffered continued hardship. Health crises, including epidemics, affected both urban and rural populations. The effects of war and civil conflict were long-lasting, with social dislocation and psychological trauma widespread. Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced the dual task of stabilizing the economy and consolidating political authority while managing the ongoing social consequences of years of upheaval. Administrative mechanisms were strengthened, local Soviets were reorganized, and the Cheka continued to enforce political discipline. These measures allowed the government to maintain order and implement reforms, though resistance and unrest remained in some areas. In 1922, a major political milestone was achieved with the formal creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. This new federal structure united Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics into a single state. The creation of the USSR formalized the territorial and political consolidation achieved under Bolshevik leadership and provided a framework for governing a vast and diverse nation. It allowed for coordinated administration, centralized economic planning, and the integration of multiple ethnic and regional populations under the authority of the Communist Party. The USSR represented both the culmination of revolutionary efforts and the beginning of a new stage in Russian history, combining socialist ideology with pragmatic governance structures. While political control was consolidated, Lenin's health began to decline. A series of strokes in 1922 and 1923 limited his capacity to govern effectively. Despite his physical deterioration, Lenin remained influential in shaping the policies and direction of the new Soviet state. His writings and directives continued to guide party decisions, including strategies for economic development, administrative organization, and ideological education. Lenin's health crisis also prompted internal debates about succession and leadership within the Communist Party, raising questions about the future direction of the USSR and the consolidation of power among senior Bolsheviks. The social consequences of the revolution and civil war remained profound. Urban populations had been reduced due to mortality, displacement, and migration, while rural areas had experienced significant changes in land ownership and agricultural production. Millions of families had been torn apart, with parents and children separated or lost during conflict and famine. Education, healthcare, and public services required rebuilding, and the population faced the challenge of adapting to new political and social realities under Bolshevik rule. The NEP, while stabilizing the economy, could not immediately resolve the human and social costs of the previous decade of upheaval. The period from 1921 to 1923 also witnessed efforts to institutionalize Bolshevik authority and integrate revolutionary principles into governance. Local Soviets were reinforced as administrative bodies, representing workers, soldiers, and peasants, though always under the supervision of the Communist Party. Propaganda campaigns promoted socialist ideology, literacy, and political education. The Cheka, later reorganized as the GPU, continued to monitor dissent and maintain security, ensuring that opposition forces could not disrupt the fragile stability of the new state. The consolidation of authority during this period laid the foundation for centralized governance and ideological conformity that would characterize the USSR in subsequent decades. Economically, the NEP represented a careful balance between state control and limited market mechanisms. Large industries, banking, and foreign trade remained under state authority, while smaller enterprises and agricultural production were subject to market incentives. This hybrid approach allowed for gradual economic recovery without completely abandoning socialist goals. The policy demonstrated Lenin's pragmatic approach to governance, recognizing the necessity of compromise to achieve long-term objectives. By restoring production and stabilizing urban populations, the NEP provided a platform for subsequent industrialization and modernization efforts in the Soviet Union. Internationally, the establishment of the USSR and the consolidation of Bolshevik authority marked a significant shift in global politics. Foreign powers initially hostile to the revolution began to adjust their policies in response to the new state. Diplomatic recognition, trade agreements, and limited engagement gradually replaced attempts at military intervention. The Bolsheviks also sought to influence revolutionary movements abroad, promoting socialist ideology and offering support to aligned groups in Europe and beyond. The USSR's creation established a geopolitical presence that would shape international relations for the remainder of the 20th century. By 1923, the immediate crisis of revolution and civil war had largely passed, though the country remained fragile. The NEP stabilized food production and commerce. The political structure of the USSR was formally established, and Bolshevik control was solidified across major urban and industrial centers. Lenin's declining health foreshadowed an impending leadership transition, which would have significant implications for the future trajectory of the Soviet state. The period from 1921 to 1923 can be understood as a critical phase of reconstruction, consolidation, and adaptation, bridging the violent upheavals of the previous decade with the institutionalization of Bolshevik authority. The aftermath of the revolution and civil war left a complex legacy. Social, economic, and political structures had been profoundly altered. Land reform, nationalization of industry, and the creation of Soviets transformed traditional patterns of governance and social organization. Millions of Russians had experienced the consequences of war, famine, and displacement, shaping their attitudes toward the new state and the Communist Party. The Bolsheviks' ability to stabilize the country, implement pragmatic policies, and consolidate political control during this period was essential for the survival of the revolution. In summary, the years 1921 to 1923 represented a period of recovery and institutionalization following the Russian Civil War. Lenin's introduction of the new economic policy addressed the urgent economic needs of the population, allowing for agricultural and industrial revival. The formal creation of the USSR established a unified state framework to manage a vast and diverse population. Bolshevik authority was consolidated through administrative organization, political oversight, and security mechanisms, while efforts were made to stabilize social conditions and maintain popular support. These developments set the stage for the further development of the Soviet Union and demonstrated the combination of pragmatic governance, ideological commitment, and centralized control necessary to transform revolutionary victory into sustained political power. From 1905 to 1923, Russia experienced a sequence of events that transformed the nation politically, socially, and economically. The collapse of the Romanov monarchy, the upheaval of the provisional government, and the rise of the Bolsheviks reshaped the country in less than 2 decades. The Russian Revolution was not a single moment of change, but a prolonged period in which political authority, social structures, and economic systems were repeatedly contested and redefined. Each phase of this period built upon the previous one, linking widespread discontent, war, and revolutionary action into a continuous historical process. The revolution began with the 1905 uprising, which challenged the authority of Tsar Nicholas II and demonstrated that the autocracy could be opposed by collective action. Workers, soldiers, and peasants tested the limits of imperial power through strikes, demonstrations, and localized insurrections. Although the Tsar survived this initial challenge, the October Manifesto and the establishment of the Duma were insufficient to resolve underlying tensions. The monarchy's concessions were partial, and the failure to implement meaningful reforms sowed seeds of deeper dissatisfaction that would reemerge during the crises of the First World War. The years leading up to 1917 were marked by increasing tension and instability. Industrial growth expanded urban populations, creating concentrated centers of labor discontent. Socialist parties, including the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, developed ideological programs that challenged existing authority and advocated for worker participation in governance. Political polarization intensified as the provisional government struggled to maintain authority while pursuing an unpopular war effort. Soldiers faced shortages and high casualty rates, while peasants continued to press for land redistribution. By the time of the February Revolution in 1917, widespread disaffection had created conditions in which the abdication of Nicholas II and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty became possible. The February Revolution brought immediate changes, but also revealed the fragility of political authority. The provisional government, while representing a formal shift toward democratic governance, faced a dual power structure alongside the Petrograd Soviet. This division limited its capacity to govern effectively and created an opening for radical forces. Lenin's return from exile in April 1917 intensified political dynamics. His leadership, combined with the organizational capacity of the Bolsheviks, allowed for a coordinated revolutionary strategy that capitalized on the provisional government's failures. The October Revolution was the culmination of these efforts, resulting in the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks and the establishment of the Council of People's Commissars. The Bolsheviks' assumption of power introduced immediate challenges: withdrawal from World War I, while popular among soldiers and civilians, required concessions in the form of territorial losses through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Political consolidation, including the suppression of opposition and the establishment of Red Guards and the Cheka, created mechanisms for maintaining authority in a highly unstable environment. These actions ensured the survival of the revolutionary government, but also introduced new forms of state control and repression. The period following the October Revolution demonstrated the interplay between ideological goals and practical considerations in governance. The Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921 tested the resilience of the Bolshevik state. The conflict between the Reds and the Whites, combined with foreign intervention, created a landscape of extreme violence, social disruption, and economic collapse. The Red Army's disciplined organization under Trotsky, combined with the Bolsheviks' ability to mobilize urban workers and sympathetic soldiers, allowed them to prevail against a fragmented and poorly coordinated opposition. Millions of deaths resulted from combat, famine, and disease, while infrastructure and urban centers suffered widespread destruction. The Civil War exemplified the consequences of revolutionary change and the methods required to consolidate power in a fractured society. Following the Civil War, the introduction of the new economic policy in 1921 reflected a pragmatic approach to Reconstruction. Lenin recognized that the extreme measures of war communism could not sustain long-term economic stability. By allowing limited market activity, reopening small businesses, and permitting peasants to sell surplus crops, the Bolsheviks encouraged production and addressed critical shortages. The NEP stabilized urban populations, increased agricultural output, and restored a measure of confidence in the government. This period demonstrated the balance between ideological commitment and practical governance necessary to rebuild a nation after prolonged conflict. The formal creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922 marked the consolidation of political authority over Russia and its neighboring regions. This new federal structure integrated diverse populations, standardized administration, and provided a framework for coordinated economic planning and social management. The USSR established the foundation for centralized governance, enabling the Bolsheviks to implement policies at a national scale. Lenin's declining health during this period highlighted the importance of leadership continuity and raised questions about succession within the Communist Party, which would have significant implications for the future direction of the state. Socially, the revolution and subsequent civil war left enduring impacts. Millions of families were affected by mortality, displacement, and famine. Rural land ownership patterns changed dramatically, Urban populations faced reconstruction challenges, and education, healthcare, and public services required significant rebuilding. The Bolsheviks' consolidation of power, combined with pragmatic policies like the NEP, allowed society to stabilize gradually, though the psychological and social consequences of the upheaval persisted. The government's ability to maintain order while implementing reforms was critical to preventing renewed conflict and ensuring the continuity of revolutionary objectives. The Russian Revolution also had profound global implications. The establishment of a socialist state challenged existing international power structures and inspired revolutionary movements worldwide. Governments in Europe, North America, and Asia monitored developments in Russia closely, concerned about the spread of revolutionary ideology. The Bolsheviks' emphasis on socialist governance, land reform, and worker participation presented an alternative model to capitalist and monarchical systems, influencing political thought and action internationally. The revolution demonstrated the interconnectedness of domestic political change and global geopolitical dynamics. The cumulative events from 1905 to 1923 illustrate the complex nature of historical transformation. The Russian Revolution was not a single event, but a prolonged period in which social, political, and economic forces converged. Each phase, from the 1905 uprising, the First World War, the February and October revolutions, the Civil War, to Reconstruction under the NEP, built upon preceding developments. Popular dissatisfaction, military collapse, ideological innovation, and organizational strategy combined to reshape the Russian state and society fundamentally. The revolution achieved the collapse of an ancient monarchy and the establishment of a new socialist government, though at a tremendous human and material cost. The consequences of the revolution extended beyond immediate political outcomes. New institutions, including Soviets, the Red Army, and centralized administrative structures, became instruments for maintaining governance and implementing policies. Economic measures, both radical and pragmatic, were designed to address urgent crises while shaping long-term development. Social change, including land redistribution, industrial reorganization, and education reforms, transformed patterns of daily life and governance. The revolution established precedents for state authority, political ideology, and social organization that would influence the Soviet Union throughout the 20th century. The Russian Revolution also highlighted the costs of transformative change. Millions of deaths, widespread famine, and social dislocation accompanied the political and economic restructuring of the nation. Urban centers required rebuilding, rural populations faced ongoing challenges, and the psychological impact of prolonged conflict affected multiple generations. These human and material consequences underscore the scale of change involved in replacing established authority with a revolutionary government and the difficulties inherent in transitioning from violent upheaval to stable governance. By 1923, the Bolsheviks had successfully consolidated power, stabilized essential social and economic structures, and established the USSR as a formal political entity. Lenin's leadership, combined with the organizational capacity of the Communist Party, allowed the state to survive and adapt despite the extraordinary challenges of revolution and civil war. The period represents a comprehensive transformation of Russian society, demonstrating how political authority, economic structures, and social institutions can be reshaped through sustained and coordinated revolutionary action. In conclusion, the Russian Revolution from 1905 to 1923 represents one of the most significant episodes in modern history. It ended centuries of monarchy, introduced socialist governance, and redefined political, social, and economic systems in Russia. The revolution's stages, from the initial uprising through war, dual power struggles, Bolshevik seizure of power, civil war, and reconstruction, illustrate the complex interplay of leadership, ideology, popular support, and organizational strategy. The human cost was immense, but the transformation of state and society established the foundations for the Soviet Union and influenced global political developments throughout the 20th century. The legacy of the Russian Revolution demonstrates that revolutionary change involves both opportunity and consequence. Empires fall not in isolation, but in response to widespread social pressures, military crises, and political mismanagement. In Russia, the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the failure of the provisional government, and the success of the Bolsheviks illustrate how leadership, ideology, and organization converge to produce decisive historical outcomes. The events of 1905 to 1923 continue to offer insight into the dynamics of political transformation, the costs of revolution, and the enduring impact of systemic change on society and the world. By 1923, the Russian Empire had been replaced by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. An ancient monarchy had fallen, a provisional government had faltered, and the Bolsheviks had established control over a devastated, yet rebuilt, nation. Millions of lives had been lost, entire cities and regions had been reshaped, and a new political and social order had emerged from the chaos of revolution and civil war. This Russian Revolution documentary shows not only how empires collapse, but also how new systems rise in their place. The events between 1905 and 1923 illustrate the human cost of political change, the complexity of revolutionary movements, and the lasting global impact of one of history's most significant transformations. The Russian Revolution did not simply change a nation, it changed the world.